We're continuing with Pirkei Avot from the Mishnah, first code of Jewish law, put together around the year 200, and it's part of the one of the 63 tractates of the Mishnah, and then ultimately of the Talmud. And unlike the other 62, this one deals with ethical laws. So before we dive in, we're in chapter 3, Mishnah number 5. Before we dive in, I wanted to make the following point, and then I'll come right back to it. One of the big differences between Jews and Christians when it comes to sacred texts, you always, if you tune in to preachers at a mega church, you see everybody's holding their Bible. And in the Protestant view, if you give the Bible to somebody, a Christian, they can read it on their own, and it's clear as day what's required. Jews take a very different approach. Jews pretty much say that you can't really understand our sacred texts, whether it's the Torah or the Talmud or anything else. You can't understand it without a commentary, a perush. Now, here's the thing. There are many, many commentaries, and often the commentaries, they might say the same thing. They might say opposite things. How are you supposed to know what to believe? Well, that's one of the challenges. That's one of the beauties. That's one of the treasures of the Jewish tradition, that we have very different approaches and understandings. And we also need to understand that what we think isn't necessarily the right answer. Okay, having said that, we're pretty much reading Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah of Avot, straight from the Siddur or whatever text you have, and you're depending on me to bring a commentary. The truth of the matter is that there are dozens and dozens, one might even say hundreds of commentaries to Pirkei Avot. And I'm just talking about English. If you go into the Hebrew, we're talking about hundreds of commentaries, maybe even 1,000. And depending on which one you pick up, it will often give you a very different view. Just as an example, in the temple, we have Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. This is translated and annotated by Hyman Golden. We've got Ethics of the Talmud, which is a translation of the Me'am Lo'e's commentary, often a Sephardic. We've got Sayings of the Fathers by Joseph Hertz. He was the one who edited the old blue Hertz Chumash that we all grew up with. Here is Pirkei Avot from an Orthodox viewpoint. Here you've got Ethics of the Sages. This comes from more Rabbi Rami Shapiro, more of a Reform Reconstructionist approach, and on it goes. The commentaries that I personally am using to prepare for the class is the Mishnah, the commentary by Pinchas Kehati, which is a modern one. Especially, I am leaning on a new commentary from the conservative movement, which is Pirkei Avot Lev Shalem, the wisdom of our sages. I also rely on the Ethics of the Talmud, Sayings of the Fathers by R. Travers Herford, who interestingly was a Christian scholar in the late 1800s and brings a more historical viewpoint. I also consult with Pirkei Avos, which is The Sage's Guide to Living. This is from the Art Scroll, which is more of an ultra-Orthodox approach. And I also am looking at Torah from Our Sages, Pirkei Avot by Jacob Neusner. And I wanted to get to this one in a moment. Jacob Neusner, by the way, died a few years ago, was one of the great contemporary scholars of the Talmud, the history and the development, as well as the ideas. So just keep that in mind. And again, you're often going to find commentaries that either say the same thing or say opposite things. So how are we supposed to know what to believe? Well, that's left up to you to make your best judgment. What makes sense, what speaks to you. Okay, so let's dive in today. And then I want to get to Neusner, who has a beautiful commentary. Chapter 3, Mishnah 5, Rabbi Chanina ben Hachinai Umer, Rabbi Chanina says, Haneor balayla, somebody who is awake at night, the Hamhalech baderech yechidi, and who travels alone, Umifaneh libo levatala, and turns his thoughts to trivial matters. And then listen to this, Harei zeh mitchayev benafsho, he endangers his life, or he is responsible for losing his soul. That's pretty heavy kind of stuff. Being awake at night, walking alone, turning to things that are trivial. You're basically putting your life in threat. So look, if we're dealing with the first century, the second century in the land of Israel under Roman occupations, we could make the case that walking around alone at night, you were liable to get killed. There wasn't a police force, and the government wasn't going to protect you, and the government might even have been after you. And if you travel alone, you would be subject to pirates or robbers or brigands. People would just as soon slit your throat and rob you, right? So in those days, people traveled in caravans because there was safety in numbers. And the idea of trying to go alone, and certainly at night, was very dangerous, okay? And also this idea of turning to trivial kinds of things. Remember, Rabbi Chanina is part of the rabbi class. This is after the terrible defeat of the Jews during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And the main interest of the rabbis was, how do we save Judaism? How do we save the Jewish people? Right? And the rabbi's answer, by and large, was Torah. We need to get people to study Torah. So if you waste your time on meaningless things, that's not the way to save Torah and to save Judaism and to save the Jewish people. But I wanted to share with you two paragraphs that Rabbi Professor Neusner wrote. And it seems that it's almost like he was speaking to our situation today. So listen to what he says. When Hananiah says you are liable for your life, he means you endanger your life. Getting up at night and walking around by yourself in his day were thought dangerous. Many believed that the world was peopled by shades and demons who preferred to attack at night when a person was alone. But while we do not believe in shades or demons, we do know that if you spend a lot of time talking to yourself, In the end, you start believing that what you think is true and what really is true are one and the same thing. You tend to construct a world that is only private and totally personal. You separate your life from the lives of others. What then is left of your life but empty things, fantasies, wishes in places of facts, pretense instead of solid achievement? Accordingly, we recognize there may be more dangerous demons than the ones people in Hananiah's time believed lurking in dark corners of the night. More dangerous are the demons that lurk in the dark places of the soul, especially the soul unillumined by the soul of others. The demons we create for ourselves when we walk too much alone, when we wake at night in fear, these demons are no less real to us than Hananiah's demons were to him. Hananiah speaks of more than mere demons. Darkness is empty. To love to be alone is to love darkness and not light. To be with people is to be in the light, to be in life. Life is with people. You become liable for your life when you want to be empty, lonely. A holy man in the Talmud cries out, "Give me friends or give me death." That is the way of Judaism, to draw together with others, to gain life in the living with others. Ours is not a faith meant to yield solitary holy men and women living in caves in the wilderness, in deserts, or on mountaintops, despising the love of humanity and seeking only the love of God. To us, to love humanity is to love God, in whose image human beings are made. To serve God is to serve other people, and to seek God is to seek God's face in the faces of human beings. The opposite is emptiness. The penalty is the forfeiture of life itself. And I think we all feel that these days as we miss coming together in community. We can only do it virtually. That's okay, but it's really not the real thing. So thank you to Professor Neusner for helping us, reminding us the importance in the Jewish tradition of community, of people coming together. And it's not just we're afraid of either robbers who are going to mug you and kill you, or we're not just afraid of evil spirits, as people 2,000 years ago were, who are going to come and somehow kill you or destroy you. We're worried about what happens to people who are lonely, people who don't have a community that they can fall back on. Well, for right now, this is the best that we can do. Hopefully, very soon, we will come back to some kind of normalcy. Next Mishnah, number 6, chapter 3. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana Omer. Kol hamikabel, anybody who accepts upon himself all Torah, the yoke. Think of an ox who has a yoke that's attached to the plow. Okay, so this heavy piece of wood on his back that he needs to pull, and this is a very difficult thing to have on your neck and your back, but ultimately it's what helps the ox to do the critical work of plowing up the ground. So anybody who accepts, receives on himself the yoke of Torah, ma'avirin mimenu, we take off of him all malchut, the yoke of citizenship or of the kingdom, the old derech eretz, and the yoke of earning a livelihood. The kol haporek mimenu, anybody who throws off this yoke of Torah, notnim alav You have to put back on him the ol of Malchut, the ol derech eretz. You put back on him the responsibilities, the obligations that citizenship requires of you, and those of earning a living. So a couple of interesting points. Number one, notice that they refer to Torah as a yoke, something that's difficult, something that you have to carry, something that's heavy, something that's on your back. We probably wouldn't on our own think of Torah as a yoke, but that's exactly what Rabbi Nechunya is telling us, that it's difficult, right? Intellectually it's difficult, and that kind of lifestyle, putting aside time and skipping other things that you might ordinarily want to do, that's number one. Number two, we have this sense of people have to make a choice, right? That if you are going to devote your life to Torah, the community will take away from you some of the obligations to make a living or obligations of citizenship. But if you're not going to take on yourself that yoke, the difficulties of Torah, then you don't get a free pass. So immediately today, we would think of, ultra-Orthodox Jews, the men, who basically commit themselves to studying in yeshiva their whole lives. Right? They don't make a living. Well, how are they supported? Either their community, or in Israel, the government provides for them. And they may not live a good lifestyle, but they're certainly enough to subsist on. And so you can imagine an ultra-Orthodox Jew who would read this Mishnah, which says, if you're going to take upon yourself the obligations of Torah, then you don't have to worry about making a living, right? The community will take care of you and your family. And you could imagine ultra-Orthodox Jews say, see, it's right here in our sacred texts, and what we're doing is good. But we've also seen in Pirkei Avot previously other rabbis who said that's not a good way to live your life, to spend it in yeshiva all day long studying. You know what? You need to live in the real world. You need to make a living. You need to work, and you need to bring in money for your family. So in a sense, we have two very different approaches here, even within Pirkei Avot. If you're going to say, well, I study in the yeshiva, I don't have a job, I don't need a job, the community's obligation or the government's obligation is to take care of me and my family, and Rabbi Nechunya is my support. Well, but we've already seen other rabbis who said differently. So you got to really be careful about choosing just this, when what we really see here is not the Jewish opinion is this. Truth is, there are Jewish opinions. This is one, that was another. And you have to figure out what's right and what's best. In modern Israel, the yeshiva kids who are 18 in their 20s, they get out of the army, don't have to serve, whereas other people who are not living in the yeshiva world say, how come I've got to go into the army for 3 years? Why do I have to risk my life for the nation, right? When that person gets a pass. And of course, the ultra-Orthodox will say, what we do in yeshiva, praying and studying, is just as important as carrying an Uzi and protecting the borders. You could argue a lot about that claim. But here's the point, that you've got very different opinions, very different Jewish opinions, and that's often the way it is. There was a very interesting midrash. Of the 12 tribes, you had 2 of them, Issachar and Zebulun, Zvulun. And we're told that there was a kind of a special relationship between these two tribes, that the tribe of Issachar would sit in their tents and they would study Torah, whereas the tribe of Zvulun, they lived by the coast, they were merchants, they went out to sea, whether it was fishing or trading, and the connection was the tribe of Zebulun said to the tribe of Issachar, we will take care of you, but we want some of your study to be for our benefit, for our sake. We can't study, you can. You're too busy to go out and make a living, we'll do that. And there was this special relationship, and often people speak about Zebulun and Issachar and how they helped one another. Another approach would be to say, you know what, instead of this guy being a specialist in that and that guy being a specialist in this, wouldn't it be better for each of us to devote part of our lives to making a living and part of our lives to learning and devotion to Judaism and the Torah? We continue with the next Mishnah number 7. Rabbi Chalafta Ish Kfar Chananya Omer. So we're now dealing with Rabbi Chalafta, who came from the village called Kfar Chananya. And we see something that should be very familiar from last week. Remember, we ended last time by talking about if two people study Torah together, it's as if God is come down and at the table, it's as if God is sitting with them. Okay, so 2 people, 3 people. So Rabbi Chalafta takes the very similar idea that we saw last week, but he is going to put his emphasis, he's going to give us a couple of other numbers, but it's more that he's showing us an interesting way, the proof text. One of the things that we always need to think about is, how does a rabbi know anything, right? Where does he get this from? The highest source of authority is the Torah. If you can say, Katuv, it's written in the Torah, that's what I'm basing myself in. Nobody can trump that. That's the highest form. Another approach is to say, well, I heard it from my teachers. Well, that's pretty good, but it's not as good as it's in the Torah, it's written. And then a third level is, I thought about it and this makes sense and it's logical and I figured it out on my own. Well, that's sort of a third level of authority. So it's written in the Torah, heard it from my teachers, I figured it out myself, right? Whenever possible, we always try to use the highest level of authority if you're trying to make an argument. And so if you have level 3 versus level 1, it just makes sense to me that this should be the right answer. And somebody comes back and says, yeah, but what about, it's written in the book of Exodus, quote, this, well, he's going to win every time. Okay, so that's a very different approach to, finding out the truth, discovering the truth, than perhaps we're used to in a Western society. So we go through the numbers, and more importantly is the proof texts that Rabbi Chalafta is going to bring us. So he starts this way. Asara, 10, sheoshvim, who are sitting together, v'oskim ba Torah, and they are engaged in Torah. Shechina, the divine presence of God, shruya, is there, beinehem, among them. So last time we talked about 2, now we're going to start with 10. So how do we know this? How do we know that God is to be found when there are anytime 10 people gather together? Shene'emar, as it says, and he quotes from the book of Psalms, Psalm number 82, verse 1. Elohim nitzav ba'adat el. God stands in the congregation of the divine, or God is present in the divine assembly. Okay, so the question is, how do we know that? How do we know that divine assembly means 10? Because after all, we're trying to prove 10. God is with 10. Where do you get that from? So now we go through a very interesting story. You'll remember Moses sent 12 spies to check out the land of Israel. 10 of them came back with a bad report. It's a wonderful land, but there's giants there. They're going to crush us. They're going to eat us and spit us out. Only 2 of the 12, Joshua and Caleb, were telling the people God was with us before. God will be with us now. We will be fine. So ultimately, God tells Moses, I'm going to punish that group, that the 10 people who brought back, of the 12 who brought back the bad report. And so God says to Moses, how long are you going to hang around with that Edah Ra'ah? They use the word Edah, which means an assembly, a group. But God, in referring to the 10, uses the word Edah. Okay? So you can sense in the book of Exodus, the word Edah is used to refer specifically to 10 people. In the book of Psalms, where it says God is present in the divine Edah, that would also be equaling 10. So God is present whenever there are 10 people who come together and they want to do something sacred, something holy. This is the basis of the idea of a minyan, and that davar shebe kedusha, that anything that speaks of holiness requires a minyan, 10 people who are above the age of bar or bat mitzvah. So what does this mean practically? It means that there are a number of prayers, a number of things that we can't do in a synagogue unless we have a minyan. What are they? Can't do the Baruch Hu to begin the service. Can't take out the Torah and call up people for aliyot. Can't say the Kedusha. And you also can't do the mourner's Kaddish. So this, since the mourner's Kaddish is the davar Kedusha, a matter of holiness, of sacredness, of invoking how holy God is. The word Kaddish and Kadosh and Kedusha and Kiddush, they're all related here. So the idea is that if we don't have a minyan, we have to skip those parts of the service. That becomes very painful for somebody who's saying Kaddish, either during Shiva or during the year of saying Kaddish. They come to the synagogue, and this is their way of connecting with the deceased relative. And all of a sudden, they're told, sorry, we can't do that. So what's supposed to happen? Well, this is especially a problem right now when we're not allowed to gather in synagogues with a minyan. So all those people who are in mourning, all those people who need or desperately want to say Kaddish but can't, what are you supposed to do? So there's a couple of approaches. One approach is exactly what we're doing. There are some rabbis who will say, okay, we can have a virtual minyan. In other words, right now in this room, I got one person. But if I check the screen, I see that there's more than a minyan who are watching. So does that count? We've got a minyan of people, but they're not all together. Now, as you can imagine, originally that answer wouldn't fly. Today, more and more synagogues are saying you know what, we're torn here, and we've got to do the lesser of two evils. So we got to make do. By the way, other rabbis will say, while you might be able to do that during the week, you certainly can't do that on Shabbos. And there are a number of synagogues in which they will live stream their services during the week, but not on Shabbat, because you can't use electronic technology on Shabbat. So that becomes an issue. Then there are others who say, you know what, a virtual minyan is not what was intended. That there needs to be a community of people who can see each other, who can hug each other, who can support one another. And if you don't have it, then sorry, you can't say the Kaddish. So what do? Rabbis will counsel their congregants to either say, instead of the Kaddish, you could do the El Malei Rachamim prayer in memory of the dead, which doesn't require a minyan. Or in the new Siddur that we use, right, there's a special prayer on page 30, which speaks in English about the ideas of the Kaddish and ends the same way, Oseh Shalom B'Mromav. But it doesn't have Yitgadal, V'Yitgadash, and Yehei Shmei Rabbah. So there are those who will say, okay, we don't have a Kaddish, we go to plan B. We do something in place of it. Okay, so those are some of the ways that people are struggling now to try to deal with the very difficult situation that we're all facing. So that was 10, and that's where we get the notion that God is found with 10. Then he goes on, Uminayin afilu chamisha. What happens if I only got 5 people who can come together, right? How do I know that God is still there? And the answer is a quote from the prophet Amos, chapter 9, verse 6, V'agudato al eretz yisada, which is God has established his band, his aguda on earth. The word aguda in Hebrew is often used when you want to hold something in your hand. Right? The idea of grabbing, of holding, is an aguda. What you can hold in your hand is an aguda. Since the hand has 5 fingers, it's sort of a clever, acute way of saying, well, that verse, God has established his band on earth. If you've got 5, then God is there with you. Then he goes into Minayin afilu shlosha. What about 3? Right? How do I know that if only 3 people gather, that God is still there with them? And the answer is a verse from the Psalms 82, Bekerev Elohim Yishpot, that God is found in the midst of judges, or God will judge in the midst of judges. One of the things that you should know is that in rabbinic jurisprudence, there wasn't a trial by jury. It was a trial by judges. And depending on the nature of the crime, you could have either a court of 3 judges, you might have a court of 21 judges, you might have a court of 70 plus judges if it was a capital kind of case. So the very fact that it says God is found where there are judges, and the minimum amount of judges you might ever have would be 3. So that's a kind of a proof text that God is to be found if 3 people, even if they aren't judges, are coming together to study Torah. He goes on, Minayin afilu shnayim. How do we know that even 2 people, that God is there? Shenet Emar, and he quotes from the prophet Malachi, Az nidbaru yirei Adonai ishel reyehu. Those who fear Adonai conversed with one another. This guy had conversed with that guy, and Adonai listened and heard. Vayakshev Adonai vayishma. So the fact that two people, the implication of the verse is that there are at least just two people there, and that God is there listening to them. And then finally comes down to Uminayin afilu echad. How do we know that one person studying alone, that God is there? Quotes from the book of Exodus, B'chol makom asher azkir et shemi. Every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, avo elecha uverachticha. I will come to you and I will bless you. Interestingly, the Hebrew is in the singular. It says, avo elecha, not alechem, to you plural, but elecha, to you in the singular, uverachticha, and I, God, will bless you. Okay, on the one hand, this is adding nothing new from what we saw last time, that God is there even when we don't have a minion. We don't have a large group. On the other hand, is it possible that something else, and what Rabbi Chalafta is doing is rather clever and it's even cute. But is there a deeper thing? He brings us these verses to prove 10 and 5 and 3 and 2 and 1. Well, what about 9? Well, he couldn't come up with a verse to prove that, or 8, or 7, or 6, or 4, right? So the idea is that he's really just showing his cleverness and his ability to pull verses out of the air. But his deeper point, beyond how clever he is for finding these sentences, proof texts, is the notion that we don't have to worry about a large group of people, right? As small as you are, to study Torah is to bring God down to earth with us. And even if you're alone, that's worthwhile. You might say, what's the good if without a minion, God isn't going to be there? God is going to be there. It's a different question, but can I say the Kaddish? But can I get an aliyah to the Torah? Right? That's different. But for now, the issue is don't despair, even if you're alone. Right? That God is there with you, and what you're doing is sacred and it's holy and it's worthwhile. Remember also that Pirkei Avot, for much of what we've read, is following the two great tragedies of early Jewish history: the destruction of the temple in 70 and the destruction of the Jewish community during the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 135. How do we pick up the pieces? People are dead. There's no institutions. They're all destroyed. They're gone, physically, spiritually. And the answer of these rabbis, despite the cleverness of their verses, is, you know what? Don't worry about that. One person opens up the Torah and studies, God is there. We continue. Rabbi Elazar, I'm in Mishnah number 8, chapter 3. Rabbi Elazar, Ish Bar Tota Omer. Rabbi Elazar says, Tain lo mishalo. Give him what is his. Sha'ata, for you, the shalach, and yours, shalom, are his. Okay? And again, if you listen to the Hebrew, you'll see it's a kind of almost a puzzle, a paradox. Tein lo mishalo, sha'ata v'shalcha shalom. Right? What is he talking about? Give everything that came from God back to God. For you and everything you have are God's. Okay, what is he really telling us? Many of the commentaries make the point that this is really about tzedakah. That if you have been blessed, if you are fortunate enough to have the means, right, then what you should do is give back, is to pay it forward. And the way Jews give back and the way Jews pay it forward is through tzedakah. It's whether it's supporting people who can't support themselves, or whether it's supporting Jewish institutions, whether it's the shul, or whether it's a school, or anything else. That's our way of God gave us, we're now giving back to God. And even though it may be, you're writing a check to an institution, in a sense, you're writing a check to God by giving to tzedakah. And also, Rabbi Elazar brings us a proof text here from the book of Chronicles, last book in the Bible. V'chein b'David hu omer, and thus David said, Book of Chronicles quotes King David, Ki mimcha hakol umiyadcha natanu lach. For all this, God, is from you, and from your own hand I give to you. Right? So again, it's one thing to say, it's really nice to give to tzedakah. Okay, good point. But if you could say, my teachers always told me, or my parents always taught me that you should help others, even nicer. But if you could say, it's written in the Bible, right? King David said it, and therefore you have the highest authority of all. So now we have the following. Mishnah number 9. Rabbi Yaakov Omer, HaMehalech Baderech V'Shoneh. Somebody who walks on the road and is studying. By the way, notice the word shoneh. It doesn't say lomed. Shoneh. Shoneh is the same word from Mishnah, the teaching. It's also the same word that you know from the Shema. Vishinantem levanecha. Right? You shall teach them these words to your children. Right? So the same word. Somebody who walks along the road and is studying. Umafsik min mishnato, and he stops from his study. The word min mishnato, literally, technically, it could be he stopped his mishnahs, but it could be in a more broader sense, just stopped what he was doing. Before I go on, you got to remember that originally the Mishnah was called the oral law, Torah Shebaal Peh. There were two Torahs, the written Torah, 5 books of Moses in the Ark, but then there is the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. That's the rabbinic commentaries and additions to the written law. Originally, the Torah, the oral Torah, was not written down. If you write something, it's literally etched, right? And you can't change it. But if it's not written, it's sort of fluid. And the idea was that the oral law, all the rabbinic teachings, they were supposed to be memorized and passed on from teacher to student. Now, in the beginning, that's not so hard. You've probably heard that among Muslims, one of the things that they do even to this day is, if you're a kid, you try to memorize the entire Quran. And if you can do that, you win a prize, right? I'm sure that among certain Jews, the idea of memorizing the whole Torah or of memorizing the whole Bible is also a great thing. The idea of knowing it in your head. How do you memorize things? memorize by repeating them over and over and over again until they're fixed in your brain. And here's the critical thing, that in these early days of crisis, after the destruction of the temple, after the Bar Kokhba defeat, when the rabbis were trying to recreate Judaism, and the original teachings of the rabbis were memorized. So people had to repeat them over and over again. And after a while, this became very difficult. The corpus of teachings was too much for most people to memorize, and it continued to grow. Or maybe that was no longer something that was felt to be important. When many of us went to school, the idea of memorizing the Gettysburg Address or memorizing a poem was considered, an important value to get in school. I doubt whether kids still do that anymore. What's the point? What do I have to memorize it for? I can look it up on my phone. It's always available. But the old ways, even when we were young, was memorization is important. And having it like that, in your head, not at your fingertips, was an important thing. So we're told that if somebody is walking along and he's trying to repeat and memorize his learning that his teacher taught him, that came in the Mishnah, right? And he says, as he's walking out on his daily walk, trying to memorize, and he says, Ma na'eh ilan zeh, how beautiful that tree is, or Ma na'eh nir zeh, how lovely a field that is, right? Ma'aleh alav ki'ilu mitchayev benafsho, that it is considered as having committed a capital offense. Now, this is pretty harsh, that you're walking along, you're doing the right thing, you're trying to remember your lessons, and all of a sudden you're taken by this beautiful scene in nature, and you stop and you say, isn't that gorgeous? You deserve death. How do we explain such a thing? That's really terrible. Well, one way to explain it, I think, is to say that this was a critical moment when it wasn't really clear, is Judaism going to survive? Is it not going to survive? And what was necessary was a generation of people who were going to be so committed to memorizing what they received and being able to pass it on to the next generation, that if you got interrupted, you're not going to remember things. You can't do two things efficiently at the same. You can't go for a walk in nature and at the same moment try to memorize what's critical for you to remember. Marshall texted me before. He looked ahead and he said, but don't we have teachings that we say a blessing when we see something beautiful in nature? And the answer is absolutely. But remember, what Rabbi Yaakov is dealing with is not that you shouldn't walk out and say, what a beautiful tree. You shouldn't do that while at the same moment you're trying to memorize this teaching and then being able to pass it along to somebody else. So it's these two things together. There would be some who would make the case that what we have here is a struggle between two philosophies of life, the Greek way and the Jewish way. And they would say what the Greeks were mainly concerned with beauty, okay? And so it would be in the Greek world that the idea of appreciating nature, appreciating the human body and its beauty. Think about Greek sculpture and the emphasis on these statues of magnificent, human beings physically. Okay, so that would be the Greek way to look and to say that person is an ideal physical type, right? And that's what we worship. That's what we want to try to emulate. Maybe that's why athletics becomes such a critical part of the Greek philosophy, because it keeps you fit. And that's the way you get your body looking like that. That's why the Olympics comes out of the Greek world. But the Jewish world, that's Hellenism. Hebraism is very different. We're not concerned so much with beauty for its own sake. Where there is beauty, right, we don't say that person is gorgeous or handsome. We say instead that person, God bless, look what God is able to do to create a magnificent creature like that. It's not about the person, it's about the creator. And that's very different. So while we can appreciate beauty, it's merely a way of appreciating God and what he does. So here we have this sense of these two different philosophies. What are Jews, if the Greeks are concerned about beauty, what are Jews concerned with? Jews are concerned about right, about good, about what's true. Okay, and so for us, doing a mitzvah is really what it's all about, doing an act of chesed, an act of kindness. So you could take it either way, that yes, these were the rabbis and later the yeshiva students who never got outside, never played ball, sat in a dark room poring over a text all day long, and that was their life, versus the people who are out playing ball, right? That's not what Jews did. Or you could say, no, what we're talking about here is not, it's not a wrong thing to appreciate beauty and to praise God for it. It's wrong to try to do these two opposite things at once, to appreciate the world and at the same moment to memorize the teachings that have come down to you. So that's our piece for today, and we'll see you Erev Pesach next week.